Hi, this is Fred Gardaphé, and this is Calandra Corner. I'm here today to chat with Marco Rafalà and talk about his new book, How Fires End. His first novel, I believe. It's your first novel, or
That's correct.
yeah, your first novel, which is a marvelous book. I'm reviewing it. We'll talk about it in depth as we go through, but let's talk a little bit about where did the inspiration come from?
So How Fires End is inspired by my father's stories of his life in Sicily during and after the Second World War. It's also loosely influenced on the folklore of Melilli. That's the village where my father grew up. And though I grew up in Middletown, Connecticut, listening to my father's stories and being influenced by the Sicilian American community, the idea of writing the novel didn't occur to me until I took a trip with him to Sicily in 2001. And being in Melilli, walking the same streets my father had spoken about, and sitting under the same tree that he slept under as a boy, visiting the graves of his cousins who died in 1943, playing with an unexploded shell, seeing the caves that my family hid in during the Allied invasion of Sicily. I found the answer to a question I didn't even know to ask, and that is, what is a Sicilian American narrative that is not about the mafia? And for me, it's about the people of a small, close-knit community like Melilli, the ordinary working class and the poor, people whose lives were deeply affected by the war. And it's about those same people who came to the United States and created a new community for themselves while carrying all of their traditions and their homeland with them. And it's about their children who straddle the question of what it means to be American and what it means to be Sicilian, and how you reconcile those two halves of yourself.
Right.
And what do you do with the weight of your parents' personal history? So from that one experience, that trip with my father, we were there for about, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. A story sort of began to take shape. Characters that were actually with me since I was very young just started demanding my attention.
The novel evolves from the story. I mean, actually, from the the prologue is told by a woman, and then the woman kind of disappears, and it goes into the story. And the epilogue, the woman kind of returns, at least as the main character. And she appears throughout the novel. Is this based on somebody in the family too, or did you create this character?
Mainly I created her, but she is sort of an amalgam of various aunts that are, various aunts of mine and a few other strong Sicilian American women in the community that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of I threw all these people that I knew into like a pot, and Nella came out.
Because she offers a lot of what the other characters don't offer. I don't want to say it's the truth, but she seems to be much less afraid to speak about these things and to bring them to the front. Whereas, do you see this as kind of a gender thing that's going on
I think it's partly gender. I think it's a lot of the tension among the characters comes from the things they can't say to one another, the things that they keep hidden even from themselves. And those silences between the characters sort of drove the novel's creation and its structure. And I think a lot of it is, well, part of it is rooted in the trauma that they experienced at a young age, and then the other is machismo. So I think it is rooted in gender, certainly. Mm-hmm. And she sort of, there's a couple of moments where she buys into that, but she eventually sees how destructive that is, and does her best to right the ship, as it were.
I mean, I think one of the keys to this novel, at least that struck me, and believe me, I read as many Italian American novels as I could find. I made my life work doing that. I don't know why, who knows, but I did it. And so when I came upon your book, I said, okay, what's new here? What is he doing that hasn't been done before? And what I found was first of all, there's a lot in terms of style, form, and especially in dealing with this idea of trauma that gets passed down from one generation to the other, that when it doesn't get discussed, when it doesn't get revealed, it gets repeated. And so we begin, so it just like fell right into place with the ideas that I've been working on in terms of trauma and untold stories, and how when people don't talk about these things. And where was I? I was listening to something the other day, and somebody said, we just didn't have the words to talk. I think Franklin Tricchia I was talking with, and he said, my parents just didn't have the words to be able to say this. And at what age do you begin to tell these stories to your kids? And do you tell anything? I mean, we have this culture of, they call it the culture of omertà, and unfortunately, it comes out, don't talk to the police.
Right,
is the way people look at it, but it's much deeper than that. It's really the code of not just masculine culture, but male dominated culture, where we don't let people know what's really going on inside of us, so that we can have more control over a situation. And what happens is, as we find out in the novel, especially through the father. I mean, I thought the father character, I think all the characters were so very well done. And I give you lots of credit for that. But
thank you.
But the father character especially, he believes that he has it together, that this is the way he's going to live his life, and his son is going, he's going to mold his son into this, and he creates this kind of these what would you call it, restrictions, or these ideas of what his son should or shouldn't do, and his son rebels against that, as most kids do whenever their parents, whenever they're reaching the point where they're realizing that there's options to what their parents have to say. And to me, this was the rich texture of the story came through, the evolution of the father character, or maybe you would call it the de-evolution. I mean, in a sense, when he does tell his story, you get the feeling that everything is going to be all right. And as a good storyteller, you say, well, it's not just enough to tell the story. There's other things that have to happen, and we're not going to do any spoiler alerts here at all. But things don't work out the way that Salvatore imagines they would when he comes to this country. The key, I think, is capturing what happens in Sicily and why that is kept a secret, and also the role that Salvatore's friend plays. What's his name again?
Rocco.
Yes.
Rocco.
In terms of like keeping an eye out, because you get the sense that there's some kind of gangster thing going on, but that's not it at all. I mean, there's this protection that he provides, not just for David, and Salvatore, but for the whole neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And so where did his character come from?
The character of Rocco.
Rocco.
When I was very young, there was a man who lived next door to my nonna and nonna's house in the north end of Middletown, where most of the Sicilian Americans lived. And when I was very young, he scared me because one of his hands was deformed, and so that just sort of stuck in my head for years. Who was this guy? We used to visit him all the time, and I would ask my father, who is he? What's wrong? What happened to his hands? And he would never tell me. And so the mystery of that sort of became is what I used to create the character of Rocco.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did did the novel evolve? Just you sat down one day and said, "I'm going to write a novel," or
I didn't. At first, I thought I was writing short stories, and I had a writing instructor who showed me the error of my ways. It was like, these aren't short stories. This is actually, you're working on something much bigger, and it's going to take you some time to figure it out and get it done. But if you stick with it, I think you'll have a novel on your hands. And so I really started with Salvatore. The first scene that I wrote was, and this is not a spoiler. It's now, I think, like a third of the way in the book. But the first scene that I wrote was that scene where he, as a young boy, witnesses as his brothers die playing with an unexploded shell in 1943. And I thought that was my opening. I thought that was, one heck of a way to open a book. And I explored what that did to this character, how it changed his life, how it affected him and the people around him. And then until I got to a point where I got to the limits of Salvatore's knowledge or what he felt comfortable saying or telling. And that's where I shifted the narrative to the United States and created his son, David. And then I, again, got to the sort of limits of what David knows. And so that's when I realized I had this extraordinarily complicated structure on my hands, much different than what I thought in the very beginning. And then the challenge was figuring out the order of these narrators.
Well, I think what you've done is you've kind of you've renewed the idea of the Italian American novel, not in any, not to say that we could put you on a shelf and leave you there, but what you've done is you've given it new life in terms of how to deal with the stories of the past and not just kind of linearly go through the immigrant story and the immigrant makes it and everything is fine at the end and he has this big family and you've really broken that up in a way that I think really revives this idea of, yes, there are things that new generations can do with the Italian American novel, even if it was your parents who were the immigrants, or
my father.
Okay.
Yeah, he came here when he was 29, and he married an American woman.
Right.
So,
all right. So you're still a little bit closer to that immigrant.
Oh yeah, growing up, I only knew all of my cousins, and we were a big family. My father had 3 sisters, 2 other brothers. One of them disappeared before I was born, and sort of the effect of that on us was also pretty significant. But and they had lots of kids, and so when I was growing up, we only just stuck together. We never really intermingled with the American kids until my father decided he no longer wanted to pay for private school. We were in a private Catholic school, and when I went to public school is sort of when I really started experiencing like American culture and all of that. And it was eye-opening, but it also showed me how alien we were. I lost my train of thought, but
the relationship of the father to of his immigrant experience to your life.
Yeah, exactly. Because he managed a very strict household, and we did things his way, which was the way he learned how to do things in Sicily. He had a garden in the backyard, and we were mostly self-sufficient. He didn't like to buy food from the grocery store. He grew it with his own hands in the backyard. He brought animals, he brought a a lamb home to slaughter it in our basement, which I'm sure is not legal in a suburban neighborhood for Easter. And then we had all this wonderful lamb for quite a while afterward. And he also raised rabbits, which I'm sure was also illegal.
Right.
But there was no telling him you can't do it this way. This is the way we've done it for generations.
Yeah, kind of like my grandfather who refused to grow a lawn. He let the weeds go wild, and the neighbors were upset. And he says, "I'm not a sheep. I can't eat grass. I eat chigoria, or I eat dandelions, and you have no right to." And of course, they rose a stink, and he had to change, but they couldn't tell him what to do in his backyard, so he had his big garden there, which is that. But
yeah, and my father would go to outlying farms and buy manure for his garden. And he turned half of we had a pretty decent sized backyard, and he turned about half of it into a garden. And in the summer, when he has that manure all over the place, oh God, it stunk, and our neighbors hated us so much for that. Yeah, and he used to take me out to forage for dandelions, wild dandelions in people's yards. He didn't think it was a big deal to just walk through somebody's property randomly without asking permission and just pick the dandelions up, because
not knowing if they had any spray or chemicals or anything.
Right, exactly. And he was just always, these Americans don't know what they have growing in their own yard. They just mow this down and they throw it away, and it's food.
Yeah. I have to send you a story I wrote called "Picking Chicoria" with my grandfather. The what's been the reception of the novel so far? I mean, you write a novel and you get it out there. Do you feel like you're done with it now, and whatever happens to it, or are you, interested in what people want to, are going to say about it? What's your take on it? I mean,
it's a strange experience. It took me 10 years to write the book. And a lot of that time thinking no one is ever going to see this. And then it gets published, and then you're terrified of what people are going to think, because everybody's going to see it. Tons of people will see it, or maybe nobody will see it, and that'll be even worse, right? Worried about what family thinks of it, worried about what strangers think of it.
So what did the family think of it? Did they read it?
My brother read it and he loved it. He told me he thought it was great. I've had some cousins who responded very positively to it. And then strangers have contacted me who are either of Sicilian descent or from Malili, have family from Malili who I don't know, who I've never met, and they contact me to say how I captured the events of 1943 so well, and they had heard stories from their father, and they were so sad that they never got a chance to really explore that before he passed away. And wonderful things like that happened since the publication, and that really was uplifting for me.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I found is that when you're reading a novel, you think, oh, this is based on the authors of, the authors here, the authors here, the authors here. But as I moved on with my career, I began to realize that that novel was done and the author is already somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So where are you now with your writing?
So I'm working on I'm actually working on a novel that my father asked me specifically to write. And how can I say no to that? And it's about a family in Malili who help an American paratrooper during the Allied invasion of Sicily. So Malili is in what was called the British zone. And on the eve of the ground invasion of Sicily, they dropped paratroopers all over the island, not all over the island, but around certain locations where the ground soldiers were going to be. But the weather was very bad. A lot of the planes got lost, and a lot of the soldiers missed their drop zones. So this one American soldier was dropped far outside his drop zone in the American zone. It ended up on the eastern side of the island where the British were supposed to be, and he was found by a family in Melilla who helped hide him from the Germans who were in their village. So that's what I'm working on, and it's also something that I heard growing up from not just my father but other people in the community that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this tradition of telling the story. Each time they told a story, they told it more fantastical than the last time. So that was the instruction that my father gave me. Was to
that sounds like it's going to be very interesting. One of the things that my family always says is, okay, so you're a writer, but what do you do for a living? You know, how do you make money? I mean, that was my biggest fear growing up, because I did grow up wanting to be a writer. But I just never had the guts just to write and see what could happen. I tried everything. I tried journalism. I tried every way of writing in order to make money. And I realized that the more I did that, yes, I made money, but I wasn't writing what I wanted to write. Mm-hmm. And so I settled on a teaching career, which supports it in some way and deflates it in another, you know, in terms of responsibilities, in terms of, you know, keeping your job and getting tenure, and you're not always writing the stuff you really have in your heart. You're writing the stuff that's going to, you know, push your career. So how do you answer that question?
Early on, I had a lot of odd jobs, and then I during the internet boom in the late '90s, I fell into a job as a database editor, which transitioned into being a technical writer, along with a few other. I wore a lot of hats at that company, but I also do freelance writing. I do writing for games, and I am lucky in that my wife is gainfully employed, so that certainly helps.
Oh, it benefits. I mean, I remember the one time that the day I made the shift from freelance writing to teaching was when my wife said I'm pregnant, and we needed to insure our health insurance, to stabilize our health insurance. And it was at a time when the health insurance was going crazy. So I said, okay, we're going to keep it secret while I shift health insurances, because they had that thing where, you know, if you were pregnant, you couldn't get insurance, you know, pre-existing conditions. But the idea of being, you know, having the writing and the time to do your own writing. I mean, do you find that the writing that you're doing in order to make money interferes at all with the energies that you need, or is it a different kind of?
No, because most of it is, well, I feel, first of all, it keeps me sharp, it keeps my skills sharp, because I'm always working on something, even if it's not creative, even if it's not my own work. But the technical writing or the writing for games, it sort of uses a different part of my brain than writing fiction. And some of the game work sort of blends the two, the sort of the technical aspect where you're explaining the rules of the game and how to play them, and how that ties into sort of the story of the game and the fiction of the game. So there's this marriage of those two halves. So I think it helps me in the end.
At what point in your life did you say, I'm going to be a writer? I mean, and what did your father say about that?
Well, you're talking to a guy who dropped out of college to be in a rock band, who, you know, did not make his parents happy when he made that brilliant decision at the age of 18 or 19 or however old I was. I didn't really know that I was going to be, or that I wanted to be a writer. I knew that that there was something in me I needed to express, and I didn't know the best avenue for that expression, which I think is why, you know, in the beginning I tried music. I played guitar. I learned how to play the mandolin. I played.
What kind of music did your rock band do?
I was in a bunch of bands. It varied. The first band I was in, it was sort of, it was the early '90s. It was alternative, um, whatever that means now. But back then, it was a little jangly pop. And then I was in like a straight up bar band for a while, and then I went back to being in mainly pop music, a little harder edged, a little danceable, a little electronic in the end. But it was really that trip that I took with my father that set me on the path to writing. And
that was your first trip back to Italy?
Yeah, it was the first time that I went to Italy with him, and I saw where he came from. And there's no other way to describe it other than it really just sort of set my feet firmly on a path that I hadn't even envisioned for myself. And at that time, I don't remember how old I was, but I was at that point in time. I was all right. Music isn't going to work for me. This isn't going to happen. I'm not going to make a living doing this. And I need health insurance. I need, when you're 20 years old, you don't think about health insurance,
right.
But when you're pushing the end of your 20s, all of a sudden,
that's exactly where I was. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's when I got the sort of what I call a straight job. I was in a cubicle working as a database editor, but I was also not particularly happy doing that. And I started looking for avenues of expression, and I went to the Wesleyan Writers Summer Conference in Middletown, where I grew up. At the time, I was living in New Haven, and that's when I started writing short stories, and I got a short story published in the Bellevue Literary Review. And around that time, my father, I think he sort of, parents have that sort of sense when their kids are in trouble, and I think he sensed that his kid was lost a little bit and needed to find his way, and he was getting too old to be lost. He should have figured this out, 10 years ago. So he was like, I'm going to go to Sicily. There's some stuff I have to do, because he owns property there. He said, why don't you come with me? And my first reaction, because my father and I had sort of a difficult relationship, was, I don't want to spend like 8 hours on a plane with him, sitting next to him in a tin can, flying, 30,000 miles above the ground. Like, no, thank you. But my mother, bless her, was like, your dad wants to help. This is an olive branch. Like, you should go. So I went, and I'm glad I did. We had our relationship changed, and I wouldn't have written the novel if I hadn't have gone. So.
Yeah, my experience was pretty similar. I went on my own. I was the first of my family to go back when I was 26 or 27 years old. And what happened was, when I returned, I went to the land where my grandfather was born, and it was from my grandfather, not my father. And then I went to, and his brother was still alive, who looked a lot like him. And I got to spend a lot of time and I learned a lot of the things my grandfather never talked about from him. And I came back, what I call an obnoxious born-again Italian. I wanted to learn the language. And it really changed. Totally changed my life. It gave me the subject matter upon which I built my career. I'm still, I've been working on novels and short stories all along. But as a way of kind of validating and maybe exploring what it was I wanted to do, I started reading all these Italian-American novels and realized that nobody had really discussed them or talked about them. And I did get caught in academia. I dropped out of college and I went back, and then I dropped out of grad school and I went back. And, I'm what I call this kind of reluctant academic. I don't trust academia, and yet I see where there's some really good possibilities to get things done.
Is that a Sicilian sort of a Sicilian thing, not trusting.
I'm not Sicilian, so I don't know, but I am Southern Italian. So
yeah, same thing.
yeah, my grandparents come from Bari, a little town called Grotta di Castellana in Puglia, and my father's mother comes from Trevino up in Basilicata, and my father's father, Gardaphé, is French Canadian, and I mean, but I think there's something to that. There's something to that, that kind of southern sense of the land. I mean, this is the first year that I've been home long enough to have a garden, for example. And and now my grandfather, because I was the oldest grandson. So my grandfather depended on me for everything, to help, to be his worker, to go out and forage for mushrooms and dandelions, and to work with him in his garden, to translate for him, to do the kind of technical things that he couldn't figure out how to do because he never knew the language very well. And so I had that as a past, plus the sound of his Italian. So when I started learning Italian, it came very naturally to me. I mean, I grew up thinking that every old person, when you get old, you speak Italian, because all the old people that I knew spoke Italian and the younger people spoke English. So I thought it was just something natural that would occur. And so, this kind of, but the experience of going to Italy did make that change. And subsequently I brought my son and I brought my daughter to Italy to be able to, and it's affected them in different ways, I mean, but, I think a couple of times they didn't, why am I doing this? Why am I doing? And then when they came back, it was, so it's really given them a sense of something larger than what they are. In terms of, being a kid growing up. My son was born in 85, my daughter in 87. So, they have this, and I knew that I grew up with a little Italy. I went to go see the Italy of my grandfather, and it was gone by the time I got there. But there was, the older people that I kind of worked with, who kind of recreated that time period for me. So those are the kinds of things that have kind of haunted me as a writer, and the kind of things that when I'm reading, I either look for or I find, I stumble upon. And your work, I didn't know what I was looking for, How Fires End. I mean, first of all, I think artistically it is an excellent work. But I also think just style-wise and all that, you had me going. You pulled me through. And by the time I got to the end, I said, wait a minute, I want to go back to the beginning, especially with the voice of Nella. So I think, the one thing I wanted to say is congratulations on having a debut novel that I think is just excellent.
Thank you.
I hope it gets all the recognition that it deserves, and paves the way for you to, work on your next work. Now, you also are involved in the literary world in other ways. What are some of those ways?
So I co-curate a reading series here in New York City called the Gorilla Lit Reading Series, and we've been doing that, I think, since 2007, maybe 2006. Wow. So it's been, it's been a long running series. We were in various places until we settled on being at Dixon Place, which is a wonderful venue in the Lower East Side, which unfortunately has been shuttered since March. And they've transitioned to doing virtual events, mm-hmm. and fundraising to sort of stay open. And we've also been doing virtual series since the pandemic.
Have you moved in any directions of publishing, or working on journals, or helping get other people jobs, or you just?
No, I haven't. My companion, who co-curates the series with me, Lee, he started his own press called Fringe. But but I haven't. That takes a lot of work and a lot of time. When I was in bands, I used to manage those bands, so I know from sort of a DIY indie perspective just how time consuming that is.
Yeah.
And I just don't. I don't have the time to give to do that anymore.
Right. Well, it's
You
good.
know.
It's good to be focused and not get kind of carried away and all the work that needs to be done, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Right. I feel that the reading series scratches that itch for me.
Yeah.
I love pairing young writers, up and coming writers who, maybe they've only just published their first short story in a literary magazine, or maybe they're a debut author with a more established author. I love doing those kinds of things when we can. And just helping promote when their book comes out or whatever on social media. I love doing that, but that's sort of I can't go any deeper than that because I'll never get any of my own work done.
Right. Yeah. And it does zap a lot of that energy that you would use just the time, especially time. How do you find yourself writing in the pandemic?
I write slowly. I think, as you guessed, it took me 10 years to write the first book. The pandemic has made it slower, but I'm trying to be patient and kind to myself. And, if I only get a paragraph done today, then that's okay. It's better than no paragraph. And, a lot of that is because of worry and, just the general nature of what's going on in the world right now. My mom was sick. She caught COVID, and they're in Connecticut and I'm here in New York. And, that was very difficult over the summer. But, we made it through. Hopefully there's a vaccine coming, and we can all get on with our lives.
Yeah. No, I found it has literally grounded me much more than I've ever been grounded, because usually I'm not home more than 2 or 3 weeks at a time. I was never home long enough to realize I need new furniture. My furniture was like from 25 years ago, and my kids kept telling me, but I never saw it because I never spent time there, and I never put any effort to grow things in the garden. And pay attention to my surroundings. I had a mother duck come and make a nest and raise ducklings, which reminded me of the Tony Soprano when he goes into his pool and the flying in there. But I had a much better experience with that, I'm sure. So it has kind of grounded me, literally kept me away from traveling, but it also has kept me away from Italy. I don't know how often you've gone back since that first trip, but I go back. I mean, that's the one good thing about this position that I have, is I get to spend a lot of time in Italy. I guess you could say one of the effects of the pandemic is my wife and I decided, when it's safe to travel again, we're going to spend more. We're going to go to Sicily, and we're going to spend like 3 months out of the year there if we can handle that. Monetarily, if we can deal with that every year, that's what we want to do. And it'll also help with the book that I'm working on. And that would be
I mean, I love.
I'll put you in touch with some of the writing people down in now. What's the closest big city that it's near? Is it near Trapani, or is it?
Melilli is in between Augusta and Syracuse.
Syracuse. Okay. I'll put you in touch with some of the writing people there that I know that be good people to know, in terms of just knowing the writing life and knowing what's going on in Sicily and all that.
Thank you.
All right, so I think I'll stop recording now. And before I do that, let me say thank you for giving us some time and getting to know you and your work a little bit better. And I look forward to reading your work for years to come.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me.